Thank you for being here on this very warm evening and a warm welcome to what promises to be a really interesting event. For those of you who don't know about the Insiders Outsiders project under which, under whose auspices this event is happening, let me just say a few words, if I may. It wasn't the first instance, and a small idea that got gratifyingly large, but the primary impulse was to pay tribute, but also to kind of analyze and scrutinize more carefully the immensely rich and pervasive contribution of, if you like, the original generation, those refugees from Nazi Europe across all the art forms who made such a profound contribution to British culture. But one of the not subtext even, but one of the kind of offshoots of that from the very start really was my own personal interest, as indeed the child of parents who came as young people to this country just in time, as they used to say, but was to look, and as an art historian, also to look particularly at the visual artists whose work is dealing in retrospect, or rather sort of in the present, but looking back at these extraordinarily complicated and rich and challenging family histories. And I have to say, well, in fact, just while I think about it, there is in fact a subsection on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel called second generation voices, or possibly second and third generation voices. So it's an ongoing concern and a kind of thread in the whole project. But I have to say, Hugo, it's actually the first time we have had somebody quite as young as you representing the youngest generation of creative people, engaging with those sorts of history. So I'm really delighted that you're here with us today. I think you all know the ropes. If you wouldn't mind keeping muted for the moment, and I'm sorry, just going to admit a few more people here. If you would like to say something afterwards, and obviously there will be opportunity to do so, perhaps just type your questions or comments in the chat in the first instance, and we'll see how things go. Yeah, the event's being recorded for posterity, so yes, that's something to bear in mind, and I'll come back to that. So let me just briefly introduce Hugo. I could go on. He's done a remarkable amount in his life already, but as he quite rightly says, the main point is, and it's interesting that the way you're identifying yourself, Hugo, as a British Austrian, British Austrian filmmaker, painter, and musician. He graduated from the Ruskin School of Art and Magdalen College in Oxford not so very long ago in 2023 with a degree in fine art, and studied film at the Friedel Kubelka, I think I'm pronouncing that right, for independent film in Vienna. And he's done all sorts of interesting things in relation to film and other things besides, which I will not go into. I think Hugo himself will tell us more. So without further ado, and with great pleasure, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Monica, for the introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be able to speak to you all today about this project, this new publication, Kosher Giraffe Trilogy, which has come together really over the last 5 years. So it's really thrilling to finally kind of have it all together. And this project brings together research and creative projects that I've undertaken in this time, exploring the life of my Austrian great-grandfather, Chaim Tannenhaus, as well as his experience interned on the Isle of Man as an enemy alien during the Second World War. So I'd like to begin with the MacGuffin, so to speak, of this project, which is an old Jewish joke that giraffe meat would be kosher, but where do you cut the neck? This is a painting called Punchline, which I painted in around 2022. And all of the paintings that we'll see on the screen are work that I've made, and there's a few exceptions which I'll identify as we go. But I think I must have first heard this joke about the giraffe, giggling at it with my siblings between the ages of 6 and 8 around the Shabbat table as children, and it's kind of followed me up to this point. So I'm going to delve into the process of producing this rather unconventional book of work which plays with this joke. And at this point, I'd also like to stress that I'm not a historian, I'm a visual artist, but I think the history is a good place to begin to see where the projects came from initially. So to summarize the book, it's fundamentally chronicling these 3 films which I made in 2023, which was the last year I was at the Ruskin of my undergraduate degree. The first film is Standing Prayer, the second is Letter Primrose Hill, and the third is Enemy Alien. And they're all executed in completely diverse filmic styles. And the book really reveals something about the making of them and keeps them all in one place. But while I will delve into the films for you tonight, there are also lots of other projects which occurred as a result of making these films. Satellite projects, whether they are musical performances, theatrical performances, conceptual performances, paintings, drawings, collaborations with friends. So we'll touch on a few of these tonight while talking about the book. But going back then to the history of where this all began, Around the first time that I heard this joke, I would have spoken with my grandmother, Meta Solomon, about her father, Chaim Tenenhaus, who fled Austria with his wife Clara in 1939. And I remember receiving these fractured stories about Chaim, and Meta remembering her childhood growing up in North London, and the shop that Chaim ran with his wife Clara in Kentish Town. And I was named after Chaim, so I share his Hebrew name. So there was always this connection, this subliminal connection, based both on fact and fiction. That, of course, when speaking with your grandmother, kind of those stories are drawn out and really become a part of you, and you're not quite sure which bits are fact and which bits are fiction. And finding out that he was a doctor of philosophy in his previous life in Vienna, I couldn't understand why his academic career didn't continue in any capacity once he settled in the UK. And there are, I think, a couple of instances of recorded bits of text of things that he wrote in his time once he was here. He was otherwise studying Hebrew texts at the back of his shop in private. He enjoyed that privacy, I think, and shared that learning also with my grandmother when she was a child. But the bits of writing that we do have are some lectures to local Jewish societies in North London, as well as a homework written for my grandmother on her behalf, answering the essay question, would you rather be a contented pig or a discontented professor? And I think that my grandmother's teacher signed off at the bottom, excellent work, Dr. Tenenhaus. So she must have picked up on the pact between father and daughter. But the only other single document kept by my grandmother revealing anything of his life really before the war, because she was born in the last year of the war, is this illustrated certificate, which was bequeathed to Chaim by fellow internees at Central Promenade Camp on the Isle of Man in October 1940. And I was mystified by this incredibly delicate pencil drawing at the centre, and also the signatures of fellow internees, friends and colleagues, which my grandmother had never spoken of. And I started to develop this desire to find out more about this period of history, and these stories of internment. And the image that we can see on the certificate, here's a close-up, is of a makeshift synagogue service taking place in one of the camps. I can't remember for sure. But just to go a bit further with the story about this certificate, this book project, Kosher Giraffe Trilogy, culminated on a trip to Manchester's Whitworth Museum at the start of last year, when around that time a friend had got in touch with me saying that they'd been to an exhibition titled Traces of Displacement, which had taken place at the Whitworth, featuring various items from the period of internment on the Isle of Man, one of which was a woodblock print of a synagogue service being taken by people who were at the camp. And I went up with my grandmother, here she is, holding the certificate that Chaim had received in the camp with its woodblock doppelganger, which must have been done by the same artist who was Paul Humpeletz in the year 1940. Interestingly, I think the woodblock print was made before the drawing, rather than the drawing being preparatory for the woodblock print. But that is where the book itself comes to a head and concludes. So I'd heard a little bit about the stories from internment. I'd followed and researched the lives of a few artists who have been interned in the camps, just to give a short historical summary for those who are less aware about this history. Musicians such as the Amadeus String Quartet, 3 members of which met while interned in the Isle of Man internment camps. Also the musical critic and thinker Hans Keller, who was there, who I was very aware of and have read his books, as well as the Dadaist artist Kurt Schwitters. And on the right is a painting of his, which is untitled, but the location of it is the Isle of Man, and he was interned, I think, for more than just 1940 into 1941. And I encountered this painting completely by surprise when I was in Hanover for a film festival, and found it very moving as an observational sketch, very different from his kind of Mertz assemblages that he made in his time at the camp. And on the left is the photo that we know more of the Douglas Promenade, and the capital of the Isle of Man, delineated by barbed wire. And just to go over the history for those who are less aware, it was with the Nazi invasion of the Netherlands that in this country, in the UK, we were concerned about fifth columnists being kind of planted, Nazi spies being planted among the refugees who come over. I think there are around 75,000 Germans and Austrians living in the UK. Some had been here for many generations, others had fled Nazi persecution in the 1930s. And so eventually, with the evacuation from Dunkirk, fear grew of these Nazi spies possibly being kind of implanted across the country. And there were these tribunals, and with a classification system between A and C, I think with A being definitely posing a threat to the UK and C being harmless aliens. And eventually, with the growing fear, all refugees, I think between the ages of 16 and was it 60, were rounded up and sent to these internment camps. So the Isle of Man hotels and homes were requisitioned. So you've got homeowners and hotel owners having to vacate their property and then being filled with the internees against their will. So the camp that my great-grandfather was at was Central Promenade Camp in Douglas. So we can see from the certificate above, provided that information. The image below is of a more recent film that I shot in September 2024, so last year, of the exact site where Chaim would have been interned. One of the buildings is not there, but it's around the Castle Mona Hotel on the Isle of Man. So this camp, I think, opened in June 1940 and had 2,000 refugees, up to 2,000 living within it. And there are 34 houses, I think. Some of the rooms in the houses looked out to the sea through barbed wire, so these would have been quite pleasant in the summer months. Other rooms looked into the dark courtyard at the back of the hotel, which would have been quite damp and dismal. And also, the more temporary stay that befell the refugees, it can't have been too pleasant to be there for a long period of time. So I've been very interested in the work that I made about the fact that these people were sheltered from the Blitz, but were conscious at any moment that the UK could have been invaded. And at the start of the internment period as well, you have very little organisation of who is in what house. So you have Nazi sympathisers living door to door with Jews. But then eventually these people were separated out, and you have these amazing creative communities of Jewish intellectuals and artists creating work in there, which I'm sure people who follow Insiders Outsiders are more aware of. So being intrigued to find out more about this history, I planned in 2022 several research trips to go to Vienna, inspired as well by a meeting with the late Dr. Max Sussman, who I'm immensely grateful to, who himself was interned. He fled Leipzig with his family. He was a child and I can't remember which camp he was at exactly, but I went to speak to him. He's the father-in-law of the rabbi at the synagogue, Westhampton Synagogue, that my family have attended for many years. And he told me about his experiences in the camps and really urged me to get in touch with the University of Vienna archive, because Chaim himself had studied at the University of Vienna, and I was able to find his 1926 dissertation, which he wrote on the history of Jews in Bukowina, which was where he'd grown up and his family were from, which, of course, after the war no longer existed as a region, historical region. And so on the left here, we have his dissertation proposal, talking about what he wanted to write about, and then on the right, his handwritten curriculum vitae, saying where he'd come from and what he'd done in his university career so far. So that was where my research journey started. I then followed that trip immediately with a visit to the Isle of Man, where I went to Manx National Heritage, the Manx Museum, to see if I could find information. A lot of the documents had been lost from internment or destroyed, so I wasn't able to find anything. But eventually these research trips were documented in a short film called Chaim, which I premiered with a live score on violin and piano at the Jacqueline du Pré Concert Hall in Oxford in May 2022. And this film both acts as a home for what I found on these trips and the questions I was starting to ask about this history, and kind of imagining within the blind spots that are presented through history, because I think, while I think historians, this is part of their role, but particularly the artists can imagine, kind of use imagination to think within these historical blind spots. I started to ask questions as well about the relationship between film and painting, between finding out information and information being outside of one's grasp and being obscured. So this is a clip I'm about to show you from the first chapter of Chaim, which is split into 4 chapters. I really hope that the sound and the image all works okay. If it doesn't, hopefully the image will work. And if there's no sound at the end of the clip, do let me know. But this is a minute from Chaim. So many of these paintings that we've just seen actually no longer exist and form part of a body of work of tablets and facades, I've called them, which really came as a result of more figurative work, more representational work I was doing, that I would have these canvases almost acting as palettes, which then I think around that time I wasn't aware of, but I would soon become aware of. This was actually the main focus of my work with these paintings, which were an accumulation of material. And I think it's also important to say at this point that the School of London painters, so-called, and Jewish immigrant artists have been a huge influence on my thinking growing up. I was practically born and bred on the work of Frank Auerbach, Leon Kosov, and going back even further to couplings such as Chaim Soutine and Amadeo Modigliani. So all of these people and their working methods are playing the work. And I think particularly thinking about the late Frank Auerbach, and because his work is almost a rehearsal. We think of the paintings accumulating along over long periods of time, but he would create an image and then destroy it and then rework it and recreate it. And eventually this kind of living thing would come as a result of this lived experience. So these tablet paintings were very much channeling inspiration from that, and from feelings I'd had while on these trips. So they were kind of living with me in the studio. This is a close-up of Facade. And to show another clip from Chaim as well, to talk about the context of the film, this is a image from a photo album that Chaim put together for his daughter and his family, to kind of bring together photographs as a kind of dedication, keep them all together. And it features his wedding invitation to who was formerly Frida. She changed her name to Clara later on. But here we can see the synagogue where they had the service of the wedding, as well as Heinz and Mangasse, their address, their home address, where they had the reception afterwards. So I went to, and we have photos of them at my grandparents' wedding at the top, and then at the bottom, the younger portrait photos of them for passport documentation. So I went to their apartment and made a sequence of the film in their apartment. So this is a clip as well from slightly later on in Chaim, where there's similar questions of kind of images being obscured and things being layered. So following that trip, some of these facade paintings that were accumulating in the studio would become figurative again. And I made these series of internment hotel facades, basically, thinking about the Victorian architecture of these requisitioned Isle of Man hotels, and the way in which the Jewish refugees, Austrians and Germans, would recreate kind of cafe culture and the salon culture, and also the creative culture of where they come from within this very, very kind of English aesthetic and architectural form. And so found this impasto visual language to be a kind of perfect rendering of the weird conflict between those aesthetic things. So while there was a series of building facades, internment paintings as well, there was a short film project called Facades of Manx Hotels, which I also created a musical composition that was in conversation with, which I performed on solo viola with a dear friend, an amazing mezzo-soprano, Marianne, who we'll see and hear in this film. So this is a blending of a version that we did, which was a kind of performance film as well as the film itself, where we can see that the hotels and situations. So these are really offcuts from the film Chaim, which I'll show you now. I really hope that you could see the whole screen actually, because I've realized I've got my little bar at the side here. So I hope that you could see Mariam as well. And here we have a still actually from the pages of the book, which reveal a bit behind the musical performance. On the left, we have the libretto text, which I wrote, kind of scribbled in a journal while on the Isle of Man, with on the right a still from the performance with my manuscript page sketches to go alongside it. And so we'll talk more about this a bit later, but gives a bit of a spirit of what the inside pages of the book are like. So now we come to the giraffe, because my main thing at the beginning of the of the talk to introduce this punchline for you is to demystify what is the connection between internment history and mostly decapitated giraffes. Um, and I hope that I can demystify this for you this evening. So with these facade paintings of these hotels, I was making paintings of these decapitated giraffes referring to this Jewish joke around the same time. They would start to wander into my paintings of the hotels, kind of their own choice. And I mean, this work is titled Internment Hotel with Enemy Aliens. So the giraffe both takes on the role of wandering Jew and the Jewish refugee of this time within this narrative. And the reason why I was so interested in this particular joke is because I think jokes are amazing carriers for stories across generations. And in this case, it reveals how amazing it is that this tradition, this kosher of koshering an animal, has survived against all odds between generations and between cultures. And yet, also, it's an extremity. It's this heightened image of a decapitated giraffe, and there's not the correct way in which to kosher an animal. And I enjoy the extremity of this, but I think the joke also quite seriously gestures towards wider misunderstandings surrounding Jewish culture and tradition, and yet is also very self-deprecating, which is incredibly characteristic of Jewish humor. So these giraffes would wander through my work, that there are these recurrent carcasses as well, which are these strange, open, abstract forms inspired by Soutine. And they wander into the cinema. This is an example of the studio space at the time. Um, and thinking as well about the language of visual artists such as Frank Auerbach and Leon Kossoff, who I felt very geographically and almost biologically related to in a strange way through process, through heritage. Um, but in a much more playful way, this, for example, is referring to a painting that Auerbach did, an incredible observational work of the Gaumont cinema, I think in the 60s or 70s. And yet a giraffe kind of wanders into the visual language of Frank Auerbach. So I'll come through these paintings, which I'd be happy to talk about later in the Q&A. Which then brings us to the first film of the trilogy, Standing Prayer, which I made in early 2023. So it was when a lot of these works were kind of coming to a head and were existing in the studio. And I was spending lots of time in giraffe enclosures because I felt this was an apt replacement to the impossibility of spending time with Chaim. We never met, and he passed away in 1978. And so despite hearing from my grandmother very often how much I reminded her of her father, I felt this connection which I could never really materialize. So in a strange way, the time spent filming giraffes and drawing from them has been a replacement to this experience. And I don't want to show you a clip from Standing Prayer because it's rather self-explanatory. It is a giraffe standing in the closure for 5 minutes with no speaking. And it's not a film that I would screen in the cinema. It's usually been shown in the past within spaces where the viewer is also standing kind of at eye level with the giraffe's knee. And I like the way in which it kind of acts as a blessing film. It's a kind of film to introduce something that is yet to come and also entertains various ideas about the Armida, the standing prayer, and the Jewish temple service. So while that film is very quiet and very still and very secular, very circular as well, the second film of the trilogy is completely different, and it's called Letter Primrose Hill, Spring Morning, which takes its name from the paintings of Frank Auerbach that he created of Primrose Hill that he would go out to sketch early on. He'd take these back into the studio and work from these rigorously. And the image compositions of this film take as their inspiration the compositions of Auerbach's sketches and really try to stand in the same spots in which he was drawing from and capture the spirit of this place. And the film came out of an attempt to meet Auerbach very late in his life. I contacted his manager, who told me that he was too busy and too old, really focusing on his work, and to be able to meet at this time. And he apologized for that. And so I wrote a letter to a friend explaining the situation, and it became this film, which I will show you in its entirety. It's just over 2 minutes.
Ich denke an dich, während ich die Straße entlang wandere. Die kleine Welt, die zwischen unseren Häusern liegt, ist ebenso die Heimat meines Lieblingsmalers, der fortwährend die Gegend zeichnet, auch in seinem fortgeschrittenen Alter. Ich fragte ihn, ob ich ihn treffen dürfe, aber er antwortete, dass ich ihm vergeben müsse, dass er außerstande sei, meine Bitte stattzugeben. Er wies auf sein Alter hin und die nur noch kurze, wertvolle Zeit, die ihm für seine Arbeit verblieb, welche Vorrang haben müsse. In dieser Nacht hatte ich einen Traum, in dem wir uns auf dem Hügel trafen, beide zeichnend, und über uns trugen große Kräne aufgehängte Giraffen auf einer Reise über den Himmel. Eine von ihnen wurde losgelassen und kam auf uns zu. Während ich diese seltsame Kreatur fern ihrer natürlichen Lebenswelt beobachtete, konnte ich nicht anders als an Chaim zu denken. Chaim fern der Heimat, fern von Wien, ein feindlicher Ausländer. Chaim all dieser Jahre forschend und seine Dissertation schreibend, nicht unterrichtend, stattdessen stilles Studieren im Schatten des hinteren Teil des Ladens, den er zusammen mit seiner Frau Clara in Kentish Town betrieb, nachdem sie sich in diesem Land niedergelassen hatten. Den ganzen Tag las er hebräische Texte, wahrscheinlich wenigstens, sagte mir meine Großmutter. Wir sahen den Giraffen zu, den Kränen, London in Baublumen, wie Kristall glitzernd im strahlenden Morgenlicht. Der Künstler hat diese Landschaft gezeichnet, Tag für Tag, 60 Jahre oder so. Aber die Giraffen hatte er nie zuvor gesehen.
So to accompany this film, I created a series of sketches while making it, which I took back to the studio and became this work titled "Whithersoever You Throw It, It Will Lie." And the title is taken from it's a kind of pun on the slogan for that the Isle of Man have on their crest, which is whithersoever you throw it, it will stand. And so the idea of a lie lying down as well, this kind of reclining figure in the bottom left-hand corner of this painting. I don't know if we can see it, but there, it could be one of Auerbach's landscapes, but then there's this carcass of this giraffe curled up and possibly rotting in the corner, obstructing this visual language. So again, thinking about the kind of ways in which to bring the joke in different ways and haunted the project. And there's a lot of the drawings, perhaps drawings for this painting and process drawings in the publication as well, which then brings us on to the last film of the trilogy, which is titled Enemy Alien. And it's the longest work out of the three of them. It's about 10 minutes long. And it's a picaresque. It's made up of lots of different sections, which all try to provide some kind of insight into internment. I'm interested that there are all these fragmented narratives and yet so little told about, and the most extreme, exciting stories about this period of history, and wanted to capture something of the spirit of that in this film. So to give an idea of the different styles at play, we can already see how the images throughout breathe, the aspect ratio, the size of the image grows over the course of the film, and there's monochromatic images, and there are these physical flesh and blood giraffes, which are filmed documentary style in the enclosure, as well as these very strange puppet and plastic versions of them, which are kind of a different imagined strategy to trying to understand this period of history. And then the film ends naturalistically. So I'll now show you a short extract from a Sabbath that takes place in one of the internment camps. Supposedly, it's introduced by a letter written by a child over the Still of the Sea that we see in the top right. So this is the Sabbath of the puppet giraffes. That's just a little taster for you. And the sequence is kind of a further flight of imagination because at the start of the internment period in the summer of 1940, men and women were kept on separate sides of the island. So you had the majority of the male internees kept at the Douglas side of the island, and then the women were over with the children at Port St. Erin. So it was only later on that families were able to be reunited. So this is very much a kind of dream of a child to be reunited with both of his parents and kind of have Shabbat together, but within this very strange environment, and the whole kind of childlike creation of this set as well, I hope will play a part of it. So I wanted to show you another extract from the book as well, which shows you how we did the scene. So these are some of my very dear friends. We have Ruth Thrush and Joe Tester and Bora Rex and Antonia Jameson on the left, all manning one of the giraffes, and they all actually have input into the book, collaborations with them and poems and translations of poems. And they've offered amazing, beautiful things, as well as David Collins, who's a wonderful painter, which I won't talk about too much here because it's all in the publication, but further colour this whole story and add a different insight into kind of refugee narratives. And so that was the experience of making that sequence in Enemy Alien, which now brings me on to the question, why make a book out of films? Because you put all this energy into making a film and it becomes this supposedly this finished temporal thing, but I really don't believe that film is a fixed medium, even narrative film. And there are all of these narratives that unfold and stories that take place in relationships that grow out of the process of making a film that then aren't necessarily lost, but become hidden and kind of concealed within the dark reserve of a final cut. And with a previous book that I made on the film called The Distance Book, I think I have this on the next slide, is an example of that publication, where I have extracts of the original screenplay, which is kind of very narratively driven, and the finished film is much more experimental. And so to transplant it onto the place in which we made the film, as well as all of the annotations that came up as we were making it, I hope to rekindle something of the feeling that we had while making it. And it's been wonderful actually to return to that book, and already Kosher Giraffe Trilogy, because it's kind of a year since this body of work culminated, and to see how little stories have been forgotten and my relationship with the work has changed, as well as those of my collaborators. And it's been wonderful to kind of preserve all this within a document. So here we have the rather unconventional screenplay for Enemy Alien that we've just seen. And the giraffe has continued as a motif in my making. It's perhaps its relationship to internment has it's kind of entered into other narratives, but it's definitely part of the vocab that I like to use visually. I'm very interested in it as a kind of negative image and the one that can be inverted. And while Chaim that we saw at the beginning of the talk, it was shot on digital video, and I made it look as if it was shot on analog film material. I have since going to Vienna to study at the Friedel Kubelke School last autumn, have started to work with analog film, which I think is much more evocative of the texture of memory and right to approach these kinds of narratives. And also the physical handling of the film material is much closer to painting. So this is a still from a new film from this year titled Showdown, which is yet to be released, but shows that this preoccupation has continued, but I really hope that it's changing. And to give you an insight into another project, which started when I started this project and has continued and taken me forwards and perhaps slightly further away from Chaim, but keeping his story alive, is a relationship with an object in the Jewish Museum of Vienna, which is a tile fragment taken from the wreckage of the Tempelgasse, the temple at Tempelgasse in Vienna, which was destroyed on Kristallnacht. And I encountered this object right after getting off the plane within the first few hours of arriving in Vienna, and was really perplexed and transfixed by it. It's a kind of abstract form, but also evocative of Hebrew lettering. And I was trying to imagine how it unspooled in situ. And so I worked on these drawings and paintings that evolved inspired by it, which now, all these years later, on going back to Vienna, have become a new film that I'm collaborating on with both my brother and sister for the first time that we've worked with each other, I think, forever, which reunites this fragment in the museum, at the Jewish Museum, with its site of origin, because one of the annexes of the former synagogue has been recreated as a Jewish centre in its original style. And here we can see some of the wall relief, which is evocative of that particular pattern. So these narratives are continuing. And so I'd like to end speaking to you now with a clip from Enemy Alien. This is the closing clip of Enemy Alien, where the Manx national anthem, which plays recurrently throughout the film, used almost ironically over this documentary footage of giraffes wandering about, occurs in its final iteration in Manx language. So it will be wonderful to talk about the book further, and I also have a copy of it here, which I can flick through for you and answer any questions. So here are the final 2 minutes of Enemy Alien. The book is available in 100 hand-signed copies. It looks something like this. And there's a lot more in there. There's more paintings, there's drawings, there are writings, there are script extracts. There's also my undergraduate dissertation, which I've left unedited since writing it in 2023 with much fear, but actually I think it reveals a lot of the inspirations that I was working with throughout this time, as well as analysis of a amazing video work by Douglas Gordon titled K364. And there's a lot more. So please do, if you're interested in purchasing a copy, they're £25 each, plus postage and packing. And you can reach out by email or order your copy at hugomax.co.uk. And I think the link is also in the chat. So very welcome now to answer any questions possible and delve further into the kosher giraffes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hugo. That was really excellent and most interesting. And why, yes, exactly. Stop sharing and let's make us all visible. Okay, how are we doing? I'll keep you spotlighted and perhaps add my own spotlight. Right, where to start? Now's your chance. I have lots of things I'd like to discuss with you. I noticed there's an interesting sounding question from Sue Weiss. Let me just make sure let's get to it. Hold on a second.
I'd also just like to say one more very little thing before we dive into questions.
Of course, of course.
This book is dedicated to my grandparents and particularly both my grandfather Henry, but also my grandmother Meta, and is dedicated to her because we discussed for many years these stories about her father, which were fragmented, and yet there are many blind spots and things which I found out along the way, which some were really exciting to find out, some were less beautiful, and it was really fantastic to finish this journey at the Whitworth Museum in Manchester, travelling up there together last year. So that was a very big part of it. Anyway, questions ahoy, but wanted to just share.
All right. So I don't know if you can see. Let me read it out anyway. So Sue Weiss asking, well, first of all, thank you for your inspiring talk and a really interesting question, which ties in with some of the things I wanted to engage with. I wanted about the role of wide-ranging multimedia practice. Is that because it's natural to you as an artist, or best for what you call refugee narratives? Question mark.
Very good question. And I think the spirit in which the book is put together is trying to channel the way in which these artists in the internment camps made work and how they always search for hope. And there are many very ironic, quite dark pieces. There's quite a famous image, I think, on the front cover of Hans Gall's Oh, What a Life, of the barbed wire harp, and all of these drawings of sunrises on the island of looking out, which the sunrise is usually a hopeful image, but to see a clear sunrise would have been to know that you haven't been invaded the next day by the Nazis and to know that you were safe for another day. So while there is a lot of darkness, I think there's also a lot of hope and amazing creative energy in the refugees' art and inventiveness with medium, and of Kurt Schwitter's creating sculptures out of porridge and drawings and paintings and finding different ways in which to make pigment and paint. So that is a part of it. However, I think I've always been interested in the point where different creative mediums intersect. At the moment, I spend most of my time scoring silent film with live scores on the viola, and it's been wonderful to spend time with German expressionist works from the 1920s and to see comparisons with paintings, say, by Egon Schiele and Ludwig Kirchner, and whether they be pictorial or certain ways of working or certain compositional styles in the music of Arnold Schoenberg. And brought up as a classical musician, that repertoire has always been integral to my kind of genetic makeup. So I don't really see another possibility. I mean, it's very attractive, I think, also in this country to specialize with a creative discipline. But I just think that's a shame. And I think all these different things speak to each other in a way that is important. And it also allows conversation with artists and thinkers of different disciplines, which is the most important thing, really.
So would you like to unmute yourself and say anything more? I don't know if you've come across Sue. She does very interesting work.
Emailed last night, actually.
Oh, fine. Okay, good.
Lovely. Thank you for your question and lovely to meet you.
Let me, Sue, let me spotlight you so everybody can see you as well.
Yeah,
There we go.
It was so great to have an insight into your practice. And actually, I had a supplementary small question, which I'm not an art historian, but it seemed to me there were all kinds of mud-like textures in your painting. I think you mentioned impasto. And I wondered if that had a kind of symbolic meaning, like the giraffe. It seemed quite an ominous method to use. So I wondered about that.
Well, it depends how much to say about the giraffe, because I think my relationship with the animal has definitely changed over the last year, as it should, from making this work, and also with the whole trilogy, that it's old work. So I have a slightly distant relationship with it. But the creation of the surfaces is in this fervor or frustration. I think oil paint is a wonderful thing, and I think it raises really exciting questions. And with it, there's this excitement of making more than just a painting, and I don't see them as just surfaces and images. I see them as objects that have a presence and have a life of their own. So it's really kind of encrusting and living with the surface for as long as possible until they reach the point whereby they can kind of walk on their own 2 feet. So it feels strange talking about them as well, but I hope that gives some kind of insight into why I think they are of this texture. It's very much about the making of them and the headspace and the spirit and the obsessiveness with which they're made.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
With my art historian's hat on, I'm struck. I mean, you mentioned Soutine, Modigliani, perhaps rather more surprising, but Soutine, the ultimate painterly, angst-ridden, sort of artist, and then Auerbach and Kossoff again, quite obviously. So the one person you didn't mention, who in fact I was looking at just this very afternoon, his wonderful self-portrait at the National Portrait Gallery, is David Bomberg, who, as I'm sure you're aware, and perhaps everybody else in the audience too, acts as a kind of intermediary between the Russian-born, Paris-based expressionist Soutine and the child refugee artist, Auerbach, and the sort of muddiness, the extreme tactility of surfaces is interesting thread, isn't it? Absolutely. Just actually a very small but perhaps significant thing that you don't know, the barbed wire harp that you mentioned on the cover of the Hans Gall memoir. I am 90% certain that's by Humpolets.
I think it is.
I think it is. So anyway, just the small, significant connection. And actually just picking up on the artists themselves working in the internment camps. And incidentally, before I forget it, another thread within the Insiders Outsiders whole project is indeed on creativity in the British internment camps, which is a whole terrain that I myself really didn't know about. Certainly growing up, my parents were, immensely grateful always to this country, and they would have been friendly aliens as it happened, because they weren't actually born in Austria and Germany. But nevertheless, it came as a huge shock to me, given their rather rosy-tinted vision of this country that took them in, to discover this very murky, morally and historically murky internment episode. Anyway, so there's a whole series of talks on various different aspects, particularly on music, but not just music, in the internment camps, which you might like to check out in due course. But yes, no, I was struck, and I can't for the life of me, I was trying to remember the artist in question, but there was one shot in one of your films of the animals carved out of the blackout material on the windows. Was it Blensdorf? It doesn't really matter, but it was one of the artist internees, and I just wondered, because one of them did look suspiciously like a Giraffe, and I just wondered if that was something you'd,
Yeah.
latched onto, and whether that actually came first before the joke, or the joke came first and the giraffe then manifested itself.
Well, thinking of the perfect moment in which I said it was in the performance of Sartre Manx Hotels with Marianne, who's singing amazingly in it, and with the film, I was trying to find a shape for the actual film for a long time, and I wanted it to culminate in those images of seeing the kind of modern shot, digital, pixelated front of the hotels, and then we enter inside, and then we also go back in time, and then that becomes inverted, and we see documented, I think it was by Major Daniel, who took quite a lot of photos of his time in internment that are in the Tate archive,
Mm.
and so credited that with Tate's permission. But to kind of shine a light, and also, yes, it is this feast of animals, and one of which is a giraffe with a long neck, so it felt fitting.
And in a way, that ties in with Sue's question about the multimedia aspect, that the extremes of ingenuity and improvisation that took place of necessity in, barbed wire seems, again, very relevant there. Yes,
Yeah.
porridge sculpture included, indeed. The other image, just thinking about the giraffe, well, two thoughts I had. I mean, one was actually just a very, very visual response. It obviously features in your book, but you showed it again as part of the film, that rather extraordinary image of the giraffes processing, as it were, towards what looks suspiciously like a concentration camp structure.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that.
Well, that painting I made last year, so it was after all of the films were made, and I was still making lots of paintings of giraffes, and the painting is titled "Move to the Left." It took a very long time to finish, and I think I left it unfinished because I couldn't work on it anymore.
Mm.
But was definitely a painting that came out of fear. I don't know how much more I'd actually like to say about it, but it's
In a
quite.
way, it's self-evident, isn't it? I guess. And then just a more general observation. I mean, giraffes are, of course, extraordinary and indeed almost absurd, anatomically absurd creatures. And I wondered if that's also part, I mean, again, not necessarily consciously, of what the giraffe is actually all about.
They're like dinosaurs, and they are like
Yeah.
aliens. And when you spend lots of time with them, they're just beautiful, and they move so elegantly, and everything about them betrays what seemed logical. And they're actually recently in a new film which I've shot in Super 8 is of parts of a giraffe skeleton, and that's a kind of beginning of a completely different narrative, actually not related to internment. But I have been very interested in looking at the anatomy of them. And actually, the day that we went to film the scene at the end of Enemy Alien, which I showed at the end of the talk, I went along with my anatomy tutor at the Ruskins, the amazing Sarah Simblett, who has published various books on drawing and is an astonishing draftswoman. And we had a lovely day just spent watching the giraffes and kind of picnicking and going back and watching the giraffes more and drawing from them. So the conversations on that day as well were hugely inspiring as we were talking about what's beneath the flesh.
I'm just looking out for any other questions. Please do chip in, anyone, or indeed actually just unmute yourselves and ask whatever it is you would like to ask. But apropos of the Ruskin, one thing that sort of immediately came to my mind is sort of a question about how both your tutors and indeed fellow students responded in your time at Oxford to what you were doing, and were there kindred spirits? Was there a certain amount of bewilderment? I mean, tell us more about that.
Well, what was exciting about the time in which I was there is that there was a return, a very fierce return to painting, which I think is really exciting. And I think actually we can see across lots of contemporary art schools at the moment, which I think is great. I think making art that was in such explicit reference to the recent past and also to the not so recent past was something unattractive. And also focusing on these particular narratives, I felt as a kind of aversion. I might have been reading into it so much, but I felt a struggle making these kind of images in this kind of way. And also when you're making things, you're not so sure about what you're making. And also within a landscape that was also heavily dominated by contemporary performance and a lot of more digitally orientated projects. Really, I wish I discovered analog film then, because I think since working with analog, it's synthesized a lot of my curiosities. And a lot of the ways in which film and moving image can come together with painting for me. But thinking back to it, I did encounter, it wasn't easy making this work there at that particular time.
And I wondered, were there fellow students or indeed, say, teachers who were perhaps engaging with difficult histories of a different nature with whom you felt a certain affinity and
Yes,
kinship?
for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely, for sure. Yeah.
Anybody in particular you might want to mention, or
Tutors-wise or student-wise?
either?
Well, thinking actually about the collaborators in the book and the people who supervised various projects that are there. David Collins, who has a wonderful 2-page spreads, who is an astonishing painter, but has converted to Judaism, and it was wonderful because I think he came to that realization while during the course of the degree, and we had a lot of conversations in that time, and we're both painting together, and we curated our degree show area together, so it felt like they're kind of coming together over a big journey. And Antonia Jameson as well, who curates a chapter in the book on a duo exhibition we did together at Fusion Arts in Oxford. The exhibition was called Grail, because giraffes happen to be my animal of affinity and hers are the less kosher snail. And so it felt apt to call it Grail. But she has been doing a lot of research into her Greek family history and trying to get her Greek citizenship, which has been very difficult for her. So we were both ploughing the depths of family archives and thinking, how do we deal with this? And the same in our dissertations. And we were both supervised by the wonderful Yuval Etgar, who's based at Luxembourg and Go Gallery in London, and writes a lot about collage, and is a wonderful man, and was just great at instigating these conversations with both of us, and it meant that we could share our essays and talk about these subjects together.
Important, interesting. Now, you mentioned citizenship, so that leads me to another question, since nobody else is talking out just yet. You describe yourself as British Austrian. You've lived in Vienna, you've been studying in Vienna. Did you know Austria before that stint, or was that
Not really. I mean, I visited twice. So the first research trip, followed by the Isle of Man visit, was in 2022 in the summer. And the second trip, I went with my grandmother to show her the documents in the archive in, I think it must have been 2023. So I'd shot a large proportion of the giraffe films. I'd made a lot of the paintings by then. And it was wonderful to come back to it. But I still knew the city mostly as a tourist and going to the Leopold Museum and just being amazed that all the Klimt and Schieler's just there. And so it was only in this time to actually make friends with the city, because I think as a British Jew aware of this history, one goes not knowing how to feel about it. And there's so much culture there to engage with, but also so much history, which is fraught with tragedy and tension and conflict. So it was wonderful to make friends with the city and make friends who are my contemporaries there living now. And the Kubelka course is a wonderful one because it's people of all ages. There are a couple of people younger than me, up to the age of in their 50s, with children, and all just hungry to get this experience of working with analog film in the city. So it was a wonderful opportunity to live there and actually understand a bit more about where we are, which may be at this point in time is not too far from where we were. We hope not, but yes.
And am I right in thinking you've applied for, or perhaps already acquired Austrian citizenship, or
Yes.
is that you've made that step?
I've made that step.
Interesting. At what point did you decide to do so?
It was very quick. I think my sister found out that it was a possibility, and we talked about it as a family and how we felt. And I was making this work at this time, and was amazed to see this document saying because of Chaim and also because of his siblings and his parents who were killed, whose names I'd seen, and a lot of them had ended up moving from Bukovina and moving to Vienna and going to the Vienna University with him. I was interested in actually making the step and going further at that time with this particular story to find out more.
Okay, a question from Brad is indeed a logical follow-on to that. I wonder how your creative expression deepened by the experience of actually living in Austria. What can you somehow?
Very, very good and very, very hard question. Thank you, Brad, for that. And I think, I mean, a lot of this work is about the relationship between fact and fiction, and definitely allowed me to understand the fact bit a bit more, I think, which of course gives grounding and has allowed, I don't think it's fair to say that the work ages quickly, but when you're making work, making so much work at different speeds that comes together at different speeds, there's not always the time to reflect on it. So it definitely provide the time, 6 months living in Vienna provided time to really reflect on the Kosher Giraffe trilogy films and work out what I think really worked about them, what spoke to me now, because my preoccupations have changed. The things I watch and read have changed since I made the films. and the work I'd like to make. The idea behind that has changed. So I think it clarified a lot for me being there. And I think in my first few months, I felt this need to, I was living 10 minutes away from Leopoldstadt where Chaim and Clara had lived, and I felt this need to kind of wear the history on my shoulders and feel the pain and feel the sadness. But actually, I got to a point whereby I realized that was completely futile and not helpful. So it was nice to be able to, it was liberating creatively to be able to kind of shed that over time with some difficulty and now think about what next for this story and for making in this way.
Mm. I was also intrigued by your mention of a new project involving your siblings, which I suspect is actually quite unusual because in my experience, certainly in my generation, which is essentially second, I guess, second generation, there tends to be the one, I think there was, Vardy, the psychologist, talked about the memorial candle, that there is one individual in the next generations who takes it upon her or himself to carry the burden, and not just the burden and the responsibility and everything else that goes with that. And tell me more about that
Well,
collaboration.
I think our relationship with
There's-
this history is completely different between us, but does also unify us. And I mean, my brother Noah, my sister Sophie, are some of the most bravest and imaginative and fearless creative practitioners I could possibly think of. And my brother is a composer. He 2 years ago wrote, or actually over many, many years, was working on the opera, but managed to put on this production of an opera of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas that he'd written, and he'd written the libretto for, and against all odds, against people who are less of a fan of the book, and also he basically reckoned with Miramax, which is practically impossible to get the rights to be able to do it. So he's spent a lot of time thinking about this history in that capacity. And my sister, who's an actor and screenwriter with projects of hers, has also entertained this past and has been thinking about this context with different narratives. And I think also has built a relationship in her own work to Clara, to Chaim's wife's story. So it's interesting that the creative parts of this project, this film, which I think will be called Tempelgasse, have occurred in very different stages. My sister came out to visit me for a week while I was in Vienna, and we filmed the sequences of the film that featured her on Super 8 in the archive at the Jewish Museum, and then also at the site of the temple on Tempelgasse. And we have very different approaches to making and different approaches to storytelling and creative practice. So actually, it was really illuminating and rewarding to be able to really accept those differences and enjoy them and see where the common ground was, of which it was very, very strong ground and exciting ground to work on. And I had a call with my brother just the other day where he's talked about the music the ideas that he's had to offer for the soundtrack, which I will perform on solo viola. So they have occurred at different stages over time. But I wanted to get the film done sooner. It's going to take longer. The edits prove very difficult. But I'm very excited about it.
Wonderful. And tell us an obvious question, perhaps, with which to conclude, future plans, other future plans. Clearly, you're bubbling over with ideas and projects.
Well, there's still ticking away a possible feature film about internment, which we'll have to see what form.
A feature film. Okay.
So that will be a narrative-based work. I have been trying to work out how best to tell the story I'd like to tell, whether to go purely through archives and tell a story rooted as much through fact, but also film by nature is an artificial medium that lies. And even in documentary, the edit is a very violent act that is deceitful. And I think to be as true as I possibly can to the emotional quality of what this time would be like, the interest of creating a 90-minute long work that would recapture the unease of being safe from the Blitz, but then with the threat of invasion at any minute, and also to celebrate the artistic work of the internees in the camps. I think I'm actually more inclined at this moment to work with fictional characters who are as close to truth as possible, who I can get to know very well on my own terms, and not betray anyone living and trying to get as close as possible to their lives. So I have been working on a script which is quite musically driven. We'll have to see whether that takes a more allegorical or a more conventionally narrative form. So that's in the works. It will take a long time. But this idea, I think, of the enclosure continues to be very important to my work and my thinking of spaces of enclosure, both creating them within painting and the site in which we work and how we work, and the ways in which we think when we're working. So that's
I'm
going to
intrigued by that because, as far as I'm aware, to date, you're very much aware and you use the terms like fragmentation, fractured stories, fragmented narratives. You talked just now rather poignantly about your sense? Was it of carrying your grandparents or your great-grandparents on your shoulders? Maybe I got that slightly wrong, but there's sort of all the things that we associate, and I don't want to get too theoretical, but I'm sure you're aware of Marion Hirsch and her very influential concept of post-memory, the sort of doomed attempts of the next generations to actually take on those histories, and yeah, the impossibility of so doing, and yet the imperative to continue trying. And your films and indeed the book, they rely very much on elusiveness and fragmentation, whereas you're suggesting that a longer film might require a very different approach. So I certainly look forward to hearing and seeing what comes of that. Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed. So it's just gone 7 o'clock. I'm just wondering, I'm surprised there are no more questions. Any more questions or indeed comments from the audience at all? Your siblings, I think, are not with us tonight, are they? Otherwise, I might encourage them to.
It'd be fun to grill them, but
No. Okay, fine. No, last chance.
last
All
chance.
right. I'm just thinking, was there anything else that I wanted to? I think we've probably covered many of the, yes, importance of jokes, obviously, really important. Yes, a connection I never felt I could materialize. Perhaps again, I'm getting that slightly garbled, but again, that ties in very much with, Marion Hirsch and what she has very influentially sort of been exploring in her own writings. Good. So, yes, shall we bring things? Oh no, that's still Brad. Lovely. As often happens, not as many people actually logged on tonight as we had expected, which is rather a shame. But nevertheless, there will be the recording. So obviously, you will know people who were perhaps intending to come, didn't. I will make the recording available on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel to add to our rich resource there within the next week or so. I should have said earlier that actually I've organised a particularly dense cluster of events, of which this is part, to coincide with UK Refugee Week. I'm sure you're aware. Officially last week, but what the hell, it can sort of bleed over into this week. And indeed, actually, the last of the sessions is going to be next Monday, very different and yet with a very important musical connection. There's a new book about the émigrés' crucial role in the early days of Glyndebourne opera, and we're going to have a really interesting event with the editor of the book and various other people from the music world besides at 6 o'clock next Monday. So do look at the Insiders Outsiders Festival.org website if you're interested in knowing about that. There'll then be a bit of a hiatus because I'm busy with other things, and high summer is looming, but we will resume in the autumn with a whole roster of, again, varied and interesting but relevant topics. And if you'd like to be kept informed, I'd urge you again to go to the website. If you scroll down to the bottom right of any page, but stick with the home page, and it's a minute's work just to sign up to receive our newsletters. Good, lovely. So thank you so much, Hugo, and good luck with all your interesting endeavours, and I very much hope we'll keep in touch. And thank you, everybody, for being with us. Many thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Monica, for the opportunity.
It's a great pleasure. Good night. Good night. Be well.